Well, good afternoon, brothers and sisters. Oh, I'm doing the same thing. There we go. At least you won't feel alone. Good afternoon, brothers and sisters. We're going to consider in this class the preparation of the beast, or the system of Europe, as we've talked about. And we're going to look at how we can be sure that this is what we're discussing is the picture that's given to us in the book of Revelation. And we're going to look at how this system develops. And we kind of touched on this in our previous class when we talked about how that there's the development of Daniel's fourth beast, and it begins in Daniel and it goes all the way through the book of Revelation. So in the book of Revelation, chapters 17 and 18, we have this picture then of this system, and it kind of has its precursor in chapter 13. So if you got your Bibles, and we'd just like to open them to Revelation chapter 13, we're introduced to two systems in Revelation chapter 13. And remember, these are simply stages of Daniel's fourth beast, right? They're not entirely separate entities, but they carry on characteristics one from the other. So we saw then, basically, when we looked at the Christian Roman Empire, that it was a beast that rose up out of the sea, and it had 10 horns and 7 heads, in this case, different to Daniel. On those horns there was the crowns with the names of blasphemy on the heads. And the beast which he saw was like a leopard, and its feet were like the feet of a bear, its mouth was like the mouth of a lion, and the dragon gave him his seat and his authority. So that Christian Roman Empire, which began around the year 312 and would basically exist really in the western side of things to around 476 or so, and then you would have the barbarians that would slowly dismantle it and destroy it until eventually it was more or less obliterated. It continued a little bit longer on the west, and of course was associated with that dragon power. So replacing it, though, when you come into Revelation chapter 13, in the second half of the chapter, you have another creature that shows up, and that's Revelation chapter 13, verse 11. He saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and it has 2 horns, like a lamb, but it speaks as a dragon, right? So again, you have that same idea, this dragon system, this Roman power, and it is covered, though, or looks like a lamb. It has horns like a lamb. So it's lamb-like, but nonetheless, it is going to have the mouth of a dragon. So we're dealing with the Holy Roman Empire that was established by Charlemagne on Christmas Day in 799, when he was crowned by the Pope as the emperor of what became known as the Holy Roman Empire, when basically the central area of Europe, France and Germany and northern Italy, were all combined together to form what was called the Holy Roman Empire. And this would last for quite some period of time. It started in the year 799, as we talked about, and it would go all the way down to around 1806 or thereabouts, when you would have the last of the Holy Roman Emperors, a guy named Francis II, who would have Napoleon come, and he would defeat him at the Battle of Austerlitz, and you would have this whole system that would be wiped out. So when we sort of just step back and sort of say, okay, what has gone on then in the book of Revelation, without going into all the details, is just to sort of take a gander through what's taken place. So we began with the Roman dragon, right? The Roman Empire, the system that had 7 heads and 10 horns upon his heads, and the crowns are upon those horns. And then, of course, this system would disappear away, and we have the Christian Roman Empire that would come in place. It was established by Constantine the Great, which is the beast of the sea in Revelation chapter 13. And then that, of course, is replaced after it's gone by the Holy Roman Empire, which is the beast of the earth in Revelation chapter 13, and the latter part, and that's Charlemagne that begins it, and we move on from there. Well, then it basically would also be destroyed, but the Bible tells us that the beast would be there in the latter days. It's going to be in some form resurrected, because in Revelation 17 and 18, we read about this woman who sits upon a scarlet-colored beast that again has these 7 heads and these 10 horns. So it's the same system that had for a period of time been taken away is going to be resurrected. And that's really the subject of our class this afternoon. So we read in Revelation 17, if you've got your Bibles open, just turn over to chapter 17. We have a description that's given there of this system in verses 3 and 4. He says, "He carried me away in spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication." So this is the system that is going to be there in the latter days. But he tells us where this thing came from. He tells us there, if you look down at verse 8, he says, look, the beast that you're looking at, the beast that you saw, it existed for a period of time, and is taken away, but then it's going to ascend out of the bottomless pit, and eventually it's going to go into perdition, and of course those who dwell on the earth are going to wonder, whose names are not written in the book of life, the foundation of the world. And when they behold the beast that was, and is not, and yet is. So it's going to be a marvelous, amazing feat that a system that existed, but then was taken away, is going to be reinstituted. So that's the situation that we have. So when we look then at the resurrection of the beast, there's been several attempts to do this. The first came under this Charlie right here. So this is the Kaiser Wilhelm II. You might remember the name from high school when you got forced to do history class, a guy named Otto von Bismarck, right? So that was his sort of Secretary of State, the guy that kind of guided him along. And they established between them what was known as the Second German Reich. Well, a Reich is an empire. Well, what was the first Reich? Well, the first Reich was the Holy Roman Empire. So they tried to put together a second Reich or empire, which was the German Empire. And of course, they tried to resurrect the beast, creating this German Empire, which led to, of all things, World War I. So this ambition resulted in about 37 million people losing their lives in trying to resurrect this beast, this system. Approximately 37 million deaths across the continent of Europe. So, of course, we know that they were not successful, and that whole system would fold, and then we'd get the Third Reich, or the Third Empire, which was under a man named Adolf Hitler. And if you notice here, this is a poster that he put together, and his little phrase here is Das Neue Europa, the New Europe, right? That's what he was trying to build, was a new Europe. That was his ambition. But of course, his little expedition cost about 60 to 85 million lives in trying to resurrect this beast, which included 6 million Jews who were targeted during the time of the Holocaust. And again, his whole process would collapse and go up in flames, and that was the end of the Third Reich at the end of the Second World War. And so at the end of this war, Berlin would be taken, but it was actually taken by the Russians. And so it was the Soviet army that would come into Berlin. There was a great race for it. In 1945, basically, it's taken over by the Soviets. And the Allies decide to carve up Germany and all the territories between them. And so here you see the Allies. You have the Russian soldier here, Montgomery, and other ones that are involved in this as they come together to carve up Germany between them and establish, basically, a new European sort of situation. And we know that it went south really quick. We already heard Churchill's little speech about an Iron Curtain descending across Europe, so we won't bother listening to that again, but there it is, the building of the Berlin Wall, the Iron Curtain. Just interestingly, the reason he used that phrase, Iron Curtain, is because at one point in time, Churchill had a chauffeur who was a Christadelphian. And they used to talk about, as they drove backwards and forwards at the sort of rip-snorting speed of 17 miles an hour, they talk about Bible prophecy. And so the whole idea of the Roman legs, the iron legs, gave birth to this phrase, we believe, of this Iron Curtain. Now, that was 1960. 15 years of posturing, basically, between the West and the East. This Cold War a war of words and a war of attrition, so to speak, where shots weren't really fired, but you had two armed forces built up on both sides. And of course, there's a problem with that. See, Ezekiel 38 describes a king of the north and a king of the south, the northern host being here and the southern host being here. It's also in Daniel chapter 11, king of the north, king of the south, are actually the Daniel 11 phrases, but the nations are delineated in Ezekiel. That's the picture that the Bible paints. But the Warsaw Pact that kind of came out of this whole problem is more of that of an Eastern empire of the Russias. So you have the Soviet Union here. This is the area of the Warsaw Pact. Here, this is the Soviet Union itself. It included Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia. But the Warsaw Pact nations here, Poland, half of Germany, and so on and so forth. That was the 1940s to the 1980s. And to counterbalance this, we of course had NATO. So the NATO alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, basically would be this group here, and later on included Turkey and Greece as a group. So this is the NATO alliance that would come up, and you have, instead of a North-South alliance, which is what the Bible paints, you have an East-West, not alliance, but hostility, right? And down the middle, of course, is this what they call the Iron Curtain. Now, writing back in 1970, in the height of this, one of our brethren, a brother Graham Pierce, had this to say in a little booklet called Russia, the Vatican, and the Invasion of Israel. He said, what we could reasonably then expect is a general large-scale reorientation of strategic positions, Britain and the U.S. reestablishing themselves in the Near East. This would bring into being the two great power blocks of the King of the North, King of the South. This would include cooperations with Israel and possibly the occupation of Egypt again at this time too. Relations between Israel and the Arabs may be changing. So here's somebody reading their Bible saying like, well, it looks like, nuclear war is going to happen tomorrow. I mean, this is the 1970s. We lived in a city called Prince George. It was part of the DEW line, the Distant Early Warning Line. There was bomb shelters all over the place. Friends at school had bomb shelters because we were one of the first places that was going to get nuked. There was a radar station there to watch the Russians coming over, and, it was a time of terror. But Brother Graham, writing right in the middle of all this, says, well, that's going to change. And you think, well, how on earth could you have the gall to say that? Well, he says the Bible says it. Like, this is what Ezekiel's picture is. Daniel says this. So we got to expect that what is looking like, world war and East versus West is going to reorientate to North-South. Well, we already looked at the whole, Berlin Wall coming down. But what that did was it removed the need to have this great NATO force in Europe at the time. And so then what happens is, of course, 1990, 1991, the Middle East bursts into flames. There is a war going on in the Gulf. And for the first time, people actually start coming out to our lectures in a long time. In fact, in Prince George, I happened to be the doorkeeper the night that we did a lecture. We were a little meeting, so you can move fast. War breaks out. Okay, whatever we were doing, scrap it. We're going to do a lecture on the Middle East, put it out in the paper. Who cares what we were planning? Let's just do this, because now is the moment. And we've got to be more like that as a community, not like, well, our schedule's made out for the next 4 years, and we can't really do a lecture on prophecy, even though Armageddon's going on tomorrow. We've got to be able to respond, right, to tell people. So we did that, and we hadn't had a visitor in Prince George in a decade. I mean, I grew up there. In that decade, not one person can I remember coming to a lecture. So I showed up at the hall, and it was like, about 6:30, lecture starts at 7, so I thought, well, I'll just make sure. It wasn't a hall, we rented a room at the college, and I thought I'll go and I'll just organize chairs, make sure it's cleaned up, students can be messy, And I get there, and there's like 20 people outside the door, and I'm like, oh, they double booked the room. Like, what the heck, So, like, I got to go find some. Before I went to find the custodian, kind of say, like, who are these people? I said, what class are you guys here for? Oh, we're here for the Bible prophecy lecture. I'm like, you're kidding me, And then I was like, and then I thought, I put the wrong time in the newspaper, because I used to look after the ad. And so I'm like, well, what time did the ad say? Oh, 7:30. I'm like, it's like 6:30 though. And they're like, well, we wanted a seat. I'm going like, okay, people, nobody's come to one of our lectures in like a decade. Like, this is just not something to worry about. So anyway, we open the doors up. They all come in, they sit down. We had 117 visitors. There is 24 of us. We're outnumbered 5-1, right? And so all these people come because for the first time, the Middle East is involved in a real hot war. And it's an exciting time, and people wanted to know in the world around us. And brothers and sisters, we must do more when those kinds of things happen, is to respond to this kind of thing. Because what had happened was everything had changed. The whole geopolitical structure of the world had completely changed with this Gulf War. So what happened was, you had NATO, right? We're all sort of like, when I grew up, the newspapers were all about 1989, our planes were coming home to Canada. Like the planes were coming home to the U.S. See all these soldiers out of work and whatever else. And some people even say, well, that's why the U.S. manufactured the war in the Gulf, but whatever. Conspiracy theory. So what ends up happening, though, because there's a war that then starts going on, NATO, first of all, decides, okay, we're going to pack it in, or a lot of the troops were to be brought home. So the Soviet Union had sort of more or less collapsed, so the need for NATO was not really seen as much. So this war then starts down in the Middle East, so the planes that were supposed to be going home turned around and ended up being planted right in the Middle East. And a lot of our soldiers and forces ended up down in the south. And so this NATO bloc would be sort of like kind of irrelevant. And what became really important was this great force in the south, the king of the south, that would face this Iraqi force in the area coming into Kuwait. And the alliance was made up of Britain, USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and other countries too. But they moved their forces back into the area of the south. Now, with America and NATO busy, putting their teeth into another area, another project was kind of going on in Europe. And that, of course, is the uniting of Europe. Because this is the picture, King of the North versus the King of the South. That's what it is at the time of the end. Somehow, this whole group up here has to come together. So while this is going up, Europe is basically putting together their own situation. The empire is growing in Europe. And we read there in the book of Revelation, as we have it in chapter 17, verse 12, the 10 horns which you see on this beast are 10 kings, just like they were back in Daniel's prophecy in chapter 7, the fourth beast, right? But these 10 kings, he says, that they don't have a kingdom yet. They're powers, but they don't really amount to much. But they're going to receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. And notice that they don't have crowns upon on the beast anymore, on the horns of the beast. It's different from that of the sea beast that had crowns upon the horns, because they don't have power. They're just a bunch of nations that kind of like, what are we going to do to get power? Well, it tells you what they're going to do. It says there in verse 13, these are going to have one mind, and they're going to give their power and strength to the beast, right? So that's what they're going to do, is hand over their power and their strength to this beast. When you look at those words, power is this idea of strength, it's strong, ability, the power of influence belonging to wealth. So it's to do with money, arising from numbers, resting on armies, forces, or hosts. So that's what power is all about. It's about monetary and military force that comes together, and a force of numbers. Strength, on the other side, is this idea of the power of choice or liberty. The power of the rule of government, the power of judicial decisions, the authority to manage domestic affairs. And so it was that Europe basically began to do that back in the 1950s, 1957 actually. In 1957, you had the signing of the European Treaty. So this is the room back in, actually of all places, the Capitoline Hill in Rome, where the Roman Empire was formed. And they're here signing this treaty that is going to guarantee a coal and steel union so that no one nation would have enough resources now to build an army and take over the world. Right? That was the idea behind it. Signed in 1957 on one of Rome's 7 hills. And so, interestingly enough, this is a commentator who talks about what this was. He says, look, it was a blend of national and supranational. The EU resembles, now this is right from the mouth of, a European statesman. He says it resembles the Holy Roman Empire, which united Central Europe from the 10th century until Luther. Technically, he says, till 1806. So what he's telling us is the European Union is just like the beast that was, and is not, and is now again. the beast that was and is not and shall ascend. We read basically that they will give their power and strength to the beast. It's very interesting that when Europe actually was formed into the European Union, and when things really came together in the last decade or so, Manuel Barroso, the Spanish leader of the Commission at the time, was asked a question in 2007, President of the EU Commission, about what exactly is Europe. And I want you to listen very closely to his response.
Sometimes I like to compare the European Union as a creation to the organization of empires. The empires. And because we have the dimension of empires. But there is a great difference. The empires were usually made through force, with a center that was imposing a diktat, a will on the others. And now we have what some authors call the first non-imperial empire. We have, by dimension, 27 countries that freely decided to work together to pool their sovereignties, if you want to use that concept of sovereignty, and work together to add value. I believe it's a great construction, and we should be proud of it. At least we in the Commission are proud.
So there is, from the head of the EU, the top job in Europe, he says, what is the European Union? It's an empire. He said, but it's not like other empires, and I'm kind of translating for a Spanish accent. He says, most empires were like a center that forces a dictate on others, right? You conquer them and you tell them what you want. He says, in Europe, it's really neat. He says, we have a group of nations that have decided to pool their sovereignty to, in the words of Revelation, give their power and strength to the beast. And he just turns around and says, that's what we have. We have an empire in Europe. We have a beast that was and is not, and yet is a beast made up of nations that by themselves they have no kingdom, but they receive their power as kings 1 hour with the beast. Now listen to that. The 10 horns which you saw receive no kingdom as yet. They don't have strength by themselves, but together they will. So in November of 1995, the same guy, actually it was 2014, had something to say about this very thing. One nation, because it was when Britain's kind of starting to say, we're out, you know. So he tried to say, look, by yourselves, and this is what he had to say.
Today, even the largest, proudest European nation cannot hope to shape globalization or even retain marginal relevance by itself. It is only together that we have the weight to influence the big picture. I believe that our future is an ever closer union of the peoples of Europe, acting as sovereign nations to freely pool their effort and power where they can deliver results that are in their own self-interest. My experience is that those countries which use European leverage to project their interests globally matter more.
So you pick that up. It's by yourselves. I don't care how good and strong a nation you are. You don't really amount to much. But together, we're strong. And we project our power jointly into the rest of the world, and we can hope to influence the global world. Well, if we don't pick up, brothers and sisters, the politics of the world, the angels have been busy at work helping us to kind of figure out some of the symbols. So here are some of those symbols. Here is the woman riding the beast. Well, what is it? It's a European postage stamp celebrating the European Union, using the imagery of Europa, the daughter of the Phoenician king of Tyre, of all places, who is riding Zeus, the bull, and that's where Europe's name comes from. It comes from a woman who is kidnapped by Zeus, the bull, and taken away. Woman riding a beast. So Time magazine, 1991, turns around and decides it's going to depict the new Europe. Well, how are we going to do that? Well, they use an image. They have an image of a woman riding a beast with all these flags. Interestingly enough, the flag that's not there is the British flag. And, you know, if we weren't sort of picking up on that imagery, don't forget the words of the book of Revelation, that this woman is mystery. It's Babylon the Great. This is Babel reincarnated. Daniel chapter 2, it's the kingdom of men, the head of gold of which is Babylon. So it is, of course, that Tower of Babel imagery that the European Union in 1992 said, hey, that's really cool. It's all these nations that pulled themselves together and they have one voice. So they made this poster up in 1992, Europe, many tongues, one voice. And it's interesting because that is an absolute affront to Almighty God, who separated the nations by language. And they're turning around and saying, we've undone that. And so not only do they put together this poster, but when they build their parliament building, well, why don't we just make it look like Babylon, the unfinished tower of the nations coming together, the parliament building in Strasbourg. And of course then they say, okay, let's strike a coin. And what do they choose? A woman riding a beast. So the angels have been busy pointing our minds in the direction of this whole situation if we weren't picking up on the detail of it. And so what we have then, brothers and sisters, is a change. We had this NATO versus Warsaw Pact situation. And we had the Warsaw Pact disappear. We had NATO, which sort of became somewhat irrelevant. But over top of this then, we have this European Union that's growing, that's kind of pushing the whole NATO thing out of the situation. And of course, we know that eventually Britain is to be taken out of this, because she's part of the King of the South Alliance, the Sheba, Dedan, Merchant of Tarshish. So NATO will be gone at one point in time, and Britain will follow soon thereafter. And the European Union is going to have its own security bloc. Now, I would like you to listen to a little piece from this whole Brexit. You probably heard about the word Brexit, the British exit from Europe, right? Because Britain's just going, this is getting loony. Like, we can't have these people in Europe telling us what we're going to do. From everything from like the curvature of a banana that can be sold in the store. If it's too curved, well then you're not allowed to sell that in your store. You have to have, like right down to it can't be called a pint of beer. It has to be 500 milliliters of beer. You know what I mean? And that really put them over the top. But like stuff like that where basically Europe is trying to tell them what they're going to do. But this whole refugee crisis from Syria has really pushed it beyond the edge. Just listen to a debate that went on in the European Union with a guy named Nigel Farage as he talks about Europe, what it was intended to be, and what it has become.
Look, nobody in their right minds would not agree that it was a sensible thing to do to get France and Germany together round the table to break bread with each other, to have a trade deal with each other back in the 1950s, and to work as sovereign democratic nations together for peace. All of that was absolutely right and high-minded. Sadly, the whole thing has become corrupted. Tony Blair said, the EU today is no longer about peace, it is about power. And how right he was, and how that power has shifted.
The rationale for Europe today is not peace anymore, it's power.
When Kohl and Mitterrand came here, representing their countries 25 years ago, it was a partnership of equals, but no longer. France is now severely diminished, trapped inside a currency, frankly, from which he can't recover. And the French voice in this relationship and in Europe is little more now, frankly, than a pipsqueak. And it's an irony, isn't it, that a project that was designed to contain German power has now given us a totally German-dominated Europe. Well, there is, I think, a bright star on the horizon. It's called the British referendum. And given that none of you want to concede Britain the ability to take back control of our own borders, a Brexit now looks more likely than at any point in modern time. And I hope and pray that Britain voting to leave the European Union will be the beginning of the end of a project, however noble its original intentions, has gone rotten.
So that's the situation in Europe, and that referendum is going to be held this June. So it's moving constantly. It's constantly on the move as things basically go forward from this point in time. And so when we read in Ezekiel that this European group that's to join in this great conflagration has to be a great company that's armed with bucklers and shields and handling swords. And remember what he said, like originally the European Union was about peace. It was about keeping Germany and France from developing armies. Not just of what Germany did in the Second World War and the First World War, but what the French did after the French Revolution. I mean, Europe had been for hundreds of years fighting each other. It was either France against the Germans, or the Germans against the French joining with the Russians against the Germans, or the Germans joining with the Russians against the French, or the Polish, as it was at one point in time, and then the Germans turning their back on, or stabbing the Russians in the back. It's just like backwards and forwards. But the Bible says they all have to come together. And and you wonder at times, well, how is Europe, this sort of placid, peace-loving group, that's what they were founded on, how are they going to end up in a situation where now they're talking about armies? Well, of course, things got a little warm just the last month or so in Europe itself again.
Good evening. Shock and horror, but sadly no surprise. Belgium, which for 4 months has been living on edge and braced for attack, took 2 devastating hits today, claimed to be the work of ISIS.
Minutes after the first bomb, another explosion near an airport Starbucks, and hundreds are running for their lives, and it wasn't over. Another bomber was about to strike in the very heart of Brussels, near the European Union's headquarters. 10 after 9, and deep underground, a massacre in the Brussels metro. A bomb has just exploded. Dozens flee through the darkness.
Prime Minister Manuel Valls joins his Belgian counterpart, Charles Michel, and the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, as they pause to pay respects at the Melbeck metro station in Brussels. Shortly afterwards, both spoke up about the need to work together for the security of Europe. Juncker, too, called for Europe-wide cooperation. We also think we need to work together towards unified security. The Commission has proposed all the constituent elements for such a union of security. I'd ask the Council of Ministers not to yield to the mounting pressure of lobbyists, and instead to keep in mind the essential, what must be done.
What they decided must be done, brothers and sisters and young people, is they must build some kind of a European security mechanism, a European army, a European police force that basically can help protect them against these kinds of things in the future. So the system that was built out of a need for peace is becoming a system, as Tony Blair said, of power, to establish Europe's power in the world. That's what its goal is now. And a system that was built to stop armament is now talking about building a European army. And that's one of the reasons the British are saying, we want out. Well, what about the woman who rides the beast? So we'll talk about this more in our last class later on. But just for a moment, it's a great harlot that sits upon the waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication. This woman that rides the beast. We're told in chapter 17, this is who she is. Right? She's going to direct this beast. And in verse 15, he says, the waters which you saw where the whore sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. So she would preside over many nations. And so in 1988, what happened was Pope John Paul II was called upon to address the European Union. And does that matter that the Pope spoke at the European Union? Well, here's Radio Vaticana, November 2014, talking about the new Pope Francis going to Europe, and they make this statement. He is someone who gives direction in an age in which many people feel disoriented by the fast pace the world is moving at and sometimes taking very risky paths. So this is somebody who gives direction. Directing is what a rider does when it rides an animal. They take the bit and they direct that animal. So no surprise then, of course, that the Holy Father, as they would like to call him, shows up in November and addresses the European Union himself. And of course, remember, going back to the 1990s, in 1991, you've probably seen this article before. A guy named Peregrine Woodthorne wrote an article in the Daily Telegraph in Britain talking about now a holy European empire, where he says the Pope is calmly preparing to assume the mantle, which he solemnly believes by divine right to be his, that of the new Holy Roman Emperor reigning from the Urals to the Atlantic. And you might say, oh, Jonathan, that's yesterday's news. Well, here's today's Time magazine for 2015. The new Roman Empire, a whole article talking about the Pope and the new Roman Empire. But the subject of our class is really, this is the beast system. That's what has arisen. But what has to happen is there has to come out of its mouth these frog spirits, these doctrines or these teachings which are going to bring the nations down to Armageddon. And it's all about, remember what Joel said? When I bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem. Well, Judah is the area of Judea and Samaria, as we would have known it in biblical times, which is called today the West Bank. So it's about the West Bank, which is the mountains of Israel, as Ezekiel 38 describes them, and about Jerusalem. So there is going to be a growing hostility of Europe to the nation of Israel. That is what we can expect. And here is what the Bible has to say. We have that passage that we've been looking at in Revelation 16, verses 13 to 14. These frog spirits also come out of the mouth of the beast, which is Europe. And what they're going to do is gather the nations to the great day of God Almighty, this great battle that's going to go in the Middle East. And they're going to be these calls of liberty and equality and fraternity to somehow justify or make holy this great battle. We're told that Europe speaks with one voice by the German foreign ministry spokeswoman, who just happens to be a Muslim of Palestinian origin. And this was April 2014. Europe speaks with one voice. These shall have one mind and will give their power and strength to the beast. And now she says, well, we actually speak with one voice. Well, the question is, well, what is it that this one voice is having to say?
Sul riconoscimento dello Stato palestinese. La votazione è aperta. La votazione è chiusa. La risoluzione è approvata.
What is important that finally this parliament has taken a position and that it clearly gives a signal to the outside world that Europe is back in this important matter.
My colleague, Mr. Carver, who was shouted down by the same anti-democratic voices we're hearing now, and with respect, President, was totally ignored by you, did just a few weeks ago write to the Commission about the recognition or otherwise of British Somaliland. He was told that the European Commission does not have the ability, the power or the right to recognise new member states, and therefore the request that was made to you that this motion was inadmissible simply has to be true. And I'm asking you now, will you rule on this, and can we please strike out this vote, because we cannot tell Mrs Mogherini to press ahead. The European Commission, by their own admission, do not have the power.
Isn't it interesting, brothers and sisters, when it's about recognizing a different state, as he talked about British Somaliland, and they requested recognition. The European Union said, well, we're sorry, but we don't have the power to recognize states. Then the Palestinians come along and they recognize the Palestinian state, like an absolute hypocritical situation that's going on. And you've got to listen for those things, because you realize what they're doing in Europe and what they're doing, or with the nations of Africa or whatever it might be, and then you look at the Middle East, it's a total double standard that's going on. And so you have then people like Lady Ashton, who is the spokesperson, was basically the foreign affairs, you want to call it Secretary of State for the European Union. Resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict is a strategic priority for Europe. Europe is working with the international partners, the US, the Quartet as they call them, Russia. The EU aims to build a two-state solution with an independent, democratic Palestinian state existing side by side with Israel in peace and security. See, that's what they're telling you. This is what our plan is. It's strategic, and this is what we want. We want a Palestinian state in the land of Israel. And of course, Ezekiel chapter 38 says, well, they come against my people Israel. So what exactly do the Jews, or does Europe feel about the Jews and about the state of Israel? Well, it's seen in their actions that they've been taking over the last couple of years.
The European Commission has issued a directive forbidding all 28 member countries from having dealings with Jewish communities or companies operating outside of the Green Line.
The law would require new labeling for agricultural products, mainly wine, fruit and vegetables, as well as cosmetics. Such items would no longer be able to say "Made in Israel."
The labeling of products of the Jewish state by the European Union brings back dark memories. Europe should be ashamed of itself. It took an immoral decision. Of the hundreds of territorial conflicts around the world, it chose to single out Israel and Israel alone.
My first and abiding reaction is it's pure anti-Semitism. Natan Sharansky defined in a unique way anti-Semitism, where it presents itself in antagonism against Israel by the 3D formula: delegitimization, demonization, and double standards.
Across Europe, more cities and regions are trying to become Israel-free zones, free of the taint of what Israel critics call an apartheid state. And that reminds some of a very dark chapter in Europe's history: the Nazi drive to purify Germany of any trace of the Jews. This London Ahava cosmetics store was picketed until it finally closed down. Ahava is an Israeli company, but the BDS forces will boycott any company that has dealings with Israel. But they don't boycott any other nations. Israel is a democracy. There are plenty of cruel dictatorships around the world they could boycott, but they don't.
We support the Intifada!
The BDS movement is taking over college campuses in Europe and America. Ronnie Fraser is a college lecturer and founding director of the Academic Friends of Israel.
Students are being fed a diet of Israel is a racist state, Israel is a Zionist state, Israel equals the Nazis.
When you see a Jewish-owned shop, when you see it targeted for boycotting and violence against the store itself, you can't not help think, but this is exactly what happened in Nazi Germany, that they were boycotting Jewish-owned shops.
In Germany, Nazi persecution of the Jews also began with a boycott in April 1933. But to Jews, the goal of the BDS movement is a destination similar to Nazi Germany.
People want to see the total destruction of Israel. When people say from the river to the sea, that's what it means.
From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free!
The Nazis would call it Judenfrei, free of Jews.
I don't know about you, brothers and sisters, but I find that absolutely terrifying. I had the privilege of coming to Baltimore a few years ago, and I brought Chafin and Shoshana with me, and we went to, I went to the Holocaust Memorial Museum for one of the days while we were there. And I had never really understood before the length of effort that the Nazis went to. You spend the first hour as you walk through this museum, or at least 40 minutes, going through the propaganda section. And I was almost like, oh, come on, I got to get on with this thing. I want to actually get in to see some of the real stuff. And I was blown away. Because as you walk through this, you realize what they did was they delegitimized the Jews. They turned people against them. They accused them of all kinds of different things so that they turned them into animals. And they boycotted their stores, and they basically made these racist sort of delineations that a Jew was a lesser person, and so on and so forth. But the boycotting of stores, Kristallnacht and all that kind of came out of that. And it was the beginning of what ended up with the attempt to annihilate the Jews. Now, if you listen to what that individual had to say, is that basically, you know, this BDS, this group of boycotters from Europe, he says, like, okay, so who else do they boycott? Out of all the terrorist states in the Middle East, out of the dictatorships where there is like suppression, like Iran and so on and so forth, do these people go and boycott those? No, they don't. The one state that this group picks on is the state of Israel. That's exactly what the Bible says. And Europe has now jumped on this bandwagon, basically, that bring into their actual legislation that Israeli stores or Israeli produce or whatever is produced in the quote-unquote occupied territories, which we would call Judea and Samaria, which is the biblical heartland where the whole story of the Bible took place, places like Hebron, Bethlehem, you go up to Samaria itself, like all the story of the Bible happened in these areas. If a product is made there, you're not allowed to label it as being made in Israel now. You have to tell everybody it's made in occupied Palestine. So it's now a Palestinian area that's under the oppression of this apartheid, as they call them, Jewish state, which is an absolute ridiculous comment. Apartheid, if you go to South Africa and you study apartheid system and how that they segregated them and how that they weren't allowed into politics whatsoever. They were not allowed to sit. There were white-only benches. There was, white-only buses. There was this kind of situation. Now you go to Israel and you have Palestinians who are justice ministers, who are politicians in the Knesset, who can run for office and do run for office, who are in the police, they're in the army. Like, it's not an apartheid state at all, but that's what the world calls it because it kind of works for the news media. Now, brothers and sisters and young people, as we look at this terrible situation that is developing, Ezekiel is pretty clear what the target is. After many days, you're going to be visited. In the latter years, you're going to come into the land that is brought back from the sword, and he calls it the mountains of Israel. Joel adds it's Judea or Jerusalem and Judah that are being brought back. So this is the area of where is known as the West Bank. And we say, okay, well, what about that then? What is the position of Europe on the West Bank and on the city of Jerusalem itself?
The European Union's foreign policy chief, Federica Mogherini, reiterated on Tuesday that the EU does not recognize Israel's claim to the Golan Heights. The EU recognizes Israel with its pre-1967 boundaries, regardless of the Israeli government's claims on other areas, until a final settlement is reached. Mogherini said before a meeting in Brussels of international donors in support of the Palestinian economy. This is a shared position reaffirmed by the European Union and its member states, she added.
French President François Hollande said that an international conference to tackle the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was the best way to bring peace. He made the comments after meeting with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas ahead of a 4-day trip to the Middle East.
The German Chancellor Angela Merkel has again called on Israel to halt settlement expansion in the West Bank. She made the comments after meeting Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas in Berlin to discuss the Middle East peace process. Though the talks were recently resumed, new data shows a spike in settlement building in the first half of this year.
So there you have it, brothers and sisters. That's France, it's Germany, and it's United Europe itself, all of them saying that we don't recognize Israel's right to the West Bank or the Golan Heights, and it all kind of sparked out of Benjamin Netanyahu, who took his cabinet up to the Golan Heights, because as this whole situation with ISIS and Syria is going on, the discussion was, well, if we solve the problem in Syria, maybe Israel will give the Syrians back the Golan Heights as kind of like a, I don't know, consolation prize or something. And Netanyahu went up there and said, not a chance. This is remaining Israeli territory. There's no way, because the Golan Heights is the water source for Israel. And the Syrians already tried to divert the Jordan River once. And that's kind of like when the Israelis went in and bombed them out of there just prior to, and took over that area so that they could never do it again. So all of Europe, France, Germany, and you notice that where that all came from? It was from meetings with a guy named Mahmoud Abbas, which is the leader of the Palestinian Authority. He's the same, this is all this last week, by the way. He also went to Russia and met with the Putin. So he met with Merkel in Germany, he met with the European Union, and he met with the French, all of which are supporting now his peace initiative to have this new peace conference where a situation he hopes is going to be imposed upon Israel. And they're going to be given back the West Bank, Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights, which of course, brothers and sisters, we know from a biblical point of view, that is the flashpoint of Ezekiel, Joel, Zechariah, and so on. So we are living on the very cusp of the kingdom of God. All of this is leading to the gathering together of the nations to the battle for that place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon. Right? This is it. This is the issue. Joel says it's when I bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem. All nations will come against my people Israel, against the mountains of Israel. These are the key issues, and those are the issues that are being highlighted right now in the news. So when we look at our Bibles, and we look at the Bible in the news, and we see what's kind of going on in the world around us, we recognize that we are living on the very edge of these things. Not only that, it's that this system is anti-kingdom of God all around us. We're going to look at in our next session. But just notice this. Even after Armageddon takes place, and after Russia is destroyed in that host, when the Lord Jesus Christ calls upon the nations to submit, guess what? These are going to make war with the Lamb. And the Lamb's going to overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings. And they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. Brothers and sisters, that's us. And you ever read that passage where it says, many are called, but few are chosen? And you ask the question, well, what is the difference between called and chosen? Sometimes I've even heard Christadelphians say, well, how do I know? I remember one time somebody left the truth, and they said, well, that person obviously wasn't called. I was like, hold on a minute here. Called is the word kaleo, which means to invite. They are invited. The basis of being chosen is right up there on the screen. Faithfulness. So brothers and sisters, we're all called. Every single one of us is called. Kaleo. We've been invited to the Lord's Supper. Whether we're going to be there or not is simply down to one issue. Are we going to be faithful to the call? Because if we are, then we are called and faithful, and our faith will be counted to us for righteousness, and therefore we will be chosen. That's all that went wrong in the Garden of Eden. Lack of faith. Eve listened to the serpent rather than listening to her God. And that's what goes wrong with us, brothers and sisters, is we listen to the flesh rather than listening to our God. So what we have to do is put our trust in him. And then, as one of those hymns puts it, when the saints go marching in, we'll be in that number.